Okay. Hello, welcome. My name is Torsten Lenkner. I'm working here at the Stockholm Museum Center at Stockholm University. And my background is I'm working with aquatic ecology. So I'm generally interested in dynamics of ecosystems and multiple drivers affecting those ecosystem dynamics. Today, I hope you're in a good shape. It's going to be quite tough. I will go through some very general things, what's going on right now in terms of Earth dynamics. But then I will quickly move to regimes of theory, test of some of those, and then actually going through some case studies, not only the Baltic. And the idea is to learn from these different case studies and check if those things could also happen in the Baltic. Then I go into the Baltic, summarize that, and giving you some overall conclusions. So if you have a very specific question, you can write it directly when I'm talking, but the more general ones I think we take after the talk. Okay? Good. Are you ready to go? Yeah. So what we see worldwide is that there are a lot of pressures at the same time going on. We have overfishing. We have large fleets of fishing boats all over the ocean. We have climate change going on, increasing temperature, but also increasing the variability, changing the pattern of, for example, rainfall. We have human growth, so there's an increase in urban cities, also along coastal shorelines. We have, because of this population growth, increase sometimes in pesticides and so on. So a lot of different drivers are increasing at the same time. And in particular, you see also that there's an increase in temperature, there's a change in the food web structure in quite a lot of systems. And I will go through that in a moment. So before, in the 60s and 70s, systems were seen, especially with monitoring and so on, as a very linear dynamics. You have, of course, prey-to-prey, prey-to-predator oscillations, but in general, the thinking of managing systems were quite linear. But then, from time to time, we actually see that they can change quite abruptly. We have examples of coral reefs, of kelp systems, and we have quite a big change in the Black Sea, and we'll go through that a bit later. But not only in marine systems, you see that also in terrestrial systems, like quite a switch from savanna to desert, from grasslands to forests, and also tropical forests. So what happens, these are examples from a long-term record, is that those shifts or changes can be quite abruptly in historical terms. Here, for example, you're having a system where you have first a savanna, and then something like 5,000 years ago, there was a quite abrupt change from a savanna system to a desert system. And the interesting thing is not was just a change from savanna to desert. The interesting thing is that also the feedback change. So you're having in the savanna system still you have a lot of moisture going up, producing clouds and rainfall. Whereby in the desert you're missing that kind of feedback. So in parallel there was quite some early work on the thinking of changes, which can be a bit abrupt. And they have different names. One of the most common names in ecology is regime shift. But for example, in coral reefs, they talk about phase shift. They talk about change in attractors and so on. So a lot of different words and terms, but also different theory behind that. So I summarize that here a bit. One of the most common definitions of regime shift is a sudden, large, long-lasting shift in ecosystem structure and function. Especially in ecology, they relate that to the concept of resilience. For example, Butz Holling here in 1973 defines resilience as the ability of a system to persist in a particular domain of attraction rather than being pushed into a different domain. So that it, in other words, the ability really to withstand a change, even if the conditions change. So in a high resilience system, you have fluctuations, but you don't have abrupt shifts. Or if you have them, they can be recovered quite quickly. I'll show you in a minute how that works. So it seems to be that in ecosystems you have alternative states, or better dynamic states, which have certain structure and function and feedbacks. So a system has the ability to internally switch between different feedback dynamics. So in a very simple way, this has been shown in the cup and bowl thing. So you're having the ecosystem state here, and this is the time here. So you have your system with a certain structure and function. Then at the same time you have drivers which pushing the system, like eutrophication or climate, overfishing, whatever. And then the resilience, the capability of withstand those drivers change. So that means that your basin gets shallow and shallow, and the system might move to a different state. So in that different state, it has a different structure and has a different function. And because of feedbacks, it may retain there. So in terms of a driver is that they've found a lot of different dynamics. Some of course is the linear one, but seen that the driver might come to a certain level where it passes a threshold, and then the system can change abruptly. You have also even a case which calls hysteresis. I'll show you that also in more detail in a minute. That means that you're passing a threshold, you come to a different state, but in order to come back to say to this state, you need to reduce the driver, for example nutrients, much further so that the system can go back. That's called hysteresis. Why is it so? Well, it's because of feedbacks keeping the system in a certain state, even though you reduce the driver. So don't worry, I go into that bit more detail. This is just another figure how that is shown. But the interesting thing in why I show this here is, in this case of the hysteresis effect, is that a system can have two different states with the same environmental conditions. And that is kind of a characteristic for hysteresis systems. So that's the theory. Has been heavily debated and has been shown, or tried to be shown, in a lot of different systems, but often also on very much single species and so on. And from my view, you cannot say that really. I think it should be an ecosystem perspective. So the question is, can we really find these kind of things in real ecosystems? One of the major achievements in these regime shifts terms and hysteresis was made by Martin Scheffer and Steve Carpenter. and they have been working quite heavily on lakes. So I show you here one case of lake eutrophication to illustrate a bit how that works in reality. So normally if you have a lake with not so much nutrients in it, you have a lot of plants in there. You have seen that probably here and also in the north and so on, where you have a very clear system with plants under the water and so on. But if you increase nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, from land into the lake, and increase and increase and increase, and at some certain stage the vegetation disappears completely and the system becomes a system without vegetation but with a lot of algae, phytoplankton blooms and so on in summer. So you can change an oligotrophic lake by introducing nutrients to that, and then the system switch and it comes to a system which is a green water system with a lot of phytoplankton. Then at the same time there have been a lot of restorations going on in lakes trying to reduce nutrients to come back to this state with the vegetation, without blue-green algae, without phytoplankton. But there they found that you need to actually reduce the nutrients much further to come down to the state again with nutrients. With low nutrients and a lot of vegetation. Why is that? In a linear system, you wouldn't have any feedbacks probably. But in a case where you have abrupt shifts, and when you then again want to reverse it, you have feedbacks, and these kind of feedbacks are there to strengthen certain states. So this is the feedback which happens in those lakes. So you increase, for example, nutrients here, water, phosphorus, from land. By that, phytoplankton come in, growing, they die out. Then they're having, because a lot of phytoplankton grows, the bottom gets a lot of sediment, cestern. You have an anoxic bottom. In an anoxic sediment, there comes a lot of phosphorus again back to the water, called internal loading. And those internal loading increases the water phosphorus again more phytoplankton and so on. So the vegetation, woody plants, they don't have a chance to come back. So that's why you need to reduce this phosphorus quite heavily, and then wait even some time that the phosphorus comes out of the sediment. Then you might have a chance again that wooded plants come back. So that's the feedback mechanism, how it works in those lakes. And here are some data and some characteristics how those data looks like. In those kind of cases where you have regime shifts with the hysteresis effects, you have often, in terms of data, you have a B modality. That means that you have a lot of observations with, in this case, low cover of plants and high cover of plants. So these are these two states. This is the vegetation state, and that's the phytoplankton state. At the same time, you have, when you do relationships between these phosphorus in the water and those shade or those plant cover, you're getting different relationships, a very typical characteristics for regime shifts, because you have in these different states you have a different feedback mechanisms, you have a different function. So that's the second characteristic, that you're getting different relationships. And even with data, they could show that this is a percentage of cover here, that under the same conditions of phosphorus, for example, you can have two different possibilities of the state. One with very little plants and one with plants. So this is the characteristics of, these are the characteristics of regime shifts with hysteresis. So in lakes, sometimes a bit more simpler to study because smaller sometimes. You have field stations very close by, you can have very intensive sampling. Especially now you know how the sampling works from ASCA. Marine systems a bit more difficult because often the sampling frequency is much less. So how about regime shifts in the marine system? Are there any? Well, there have been quite some reported. Black Sea, North Sea, Northwest Atlantic, North Pacific, Baltic. These are just some examples which has been reported. What I often see is there's quite some change in the available catch, for example, of fish, or the productivity, primary productivity. There has been quite some fluctuations of these fish stocks in those systems. If you look through the literature in general, you'd see that the drivers are very different. And here often people really differently report that. Some of them are looking only on fisheries, or some of them looking only on climate. But when you look at the system, often happens is they are often caused by multiple drivers. So these are the most common ones, has been reported in those regime shifts. There's the fisheries, climate, especially temperature here, eutrophication, some invasion of new species coming in from the south or via ballast water or whatever. But very interestingly is often the interaction of those. And I said why they are important. For example, in terms of fishery, actually, if you have a high fishery, the fish stocks vary much more, because the fishery takes out often the larger species, so the smaller ones are left, and the maturation is much earlier. So that means they are much more sensitive to, for example, climate or temperature when they grow. And that can even be manifested in the evolution, so that even if you reduce fishing, you might have a higher fluctuation of those fish stocks. Just because we are talking quite a lot about ecosystem dynamics here, so just a kind of recap. In those systems, you often talk from like bottom-up flows or top-down flows. Bottom-up means that the eutrophication increases phytoplankton, increases the zooplankton and the fish and so on. But at the same time, you often find also top-down effects where, for example, a change in fishing affects the top predator, affects the planktivorous fish and so on. And often those changes has been early on, as there were schools of researchers interested in more top-down or more bottom-up. But what happens in reality often is you have a fluctuation of those. That means you have sometimes bottom-up and top-down at the same time. Here's one example how for example, the cod-prey relationship changed due to the temperature change. And so sometimes you have a bottom-up control and sometimes you have a top-down control dominated, but those can be changing quite abruptly. So in those systems, there's quite a dynamic going on. Here is just one overview of different reported regime shifts of pelagic marine systems. And you see most of them are in the northern hemisphere, but those ones reported are quite some. So these were very general. It was talking about the regime shift theory. Some examples. We do see them in marine systems. So, but before I go into the Baltic, I would like to go first through the coral reefs and the Black Sea, because I think we can learn something from them. I want to illustrate with the coral reefs the recovery potential of the system. The Black Sea, because they're having also affected by eutrophication and fishing, similar as the Baltic Sea. And then I come to the Baltic Sea dynamics. So what about coral reefs? In coral reefs, they found a lot of very well studied, and it's nice because you can. First of all, it's very nice because they're in warm areas, so you can dive and swim and enjoy, which might not always be so simple as in the Baltic because it's a bit colder. But then it's also easy to observe because you can dive and you can count how many corals are there, what's the condition, and so on. So they did a lot of experiments and long-term studies on coral reefs. And when you pulse the system, say here comes a very heavy storm on it, or change in sedimentation or whatever, you see that some systems, okay, they change in terms of reducing the coral cover, but then they very quickly recover and come back to the old coral reef. But in some cases, actually you see that the system, even though it was only a pulse, so not continuous driver, but only a pulse, so pushing it once, the system is not coming back. And now we have a look why that could be the case. Here we're having these examples. This is was published in Science. So you have this coral state, but then shifting to macroalgae with a lot of loss of fishes and so on. So in Jamaica, there was this typical example where they could see that suddenly there was a change from the coral cover to reducing, and at the same time an increase of macroalgae growing on the old coral reef. However, it seems to be not that easy. Here's some work showing that there might be a lot of different states in those coral reefs. So you might not have just a different coral cover, but you might have different species and so on. But what's most interesting is, this is one example here, where you have a coral, you have a disturbance, like a heavy storm or something like that, or you have quite high fishing, because those small fishes, they eat the small macroalgae coming up on those corals, so they clean the corals all the time. If you overfish, then those fishes cannot clean it, and then the macroalgae are growing on top of the coral reefs, and the coral reefs are dying. So that happens here. But then if you stop fishing and say the condition is getting better again, the system comes back again to a coral reef, but it's a different coral. So in terms of the regime shift, it's not a full recovery, because the recovery would be if you come back to the same community structure, same number of corals and the same kind of species composition. But in this case, actually the coral community was different. And that's something to keep in mind. So if you have a system changing, you might not come back in a typical sense. I'll show you one example from the Baltic later. Now I'm moving to the Black Sea, so I'm coming closer and closer to the first one was in Jamaica, and now coming back to Europe at least, to the Black Sea. It's over here. And in this sea, we see quite a lot of eutrophication from the Danube River, a lot of fertilizing agriculture nutrient load coming into the Black Sea, the northern shelf of the Black Sea. And at the same time, there was an increase in jellyfish. So what happens? Here I go step by step. These are long time series, over 50 years or so. And these are the predatory fish. And they were fished very heavily. So the biomass of those fish are decreasing quite heavily. Because you decrease the predatory fish, the prey fish, planktivore fish, is increasing. But at the same time, there was an increase in nutrient loading, and that, together with an increase in jellyfish, caused to a quite heavy shift in the Black Sea. So to illustrate that a bit better, here is the ecosystem state. We have a pristine condition, and then you increase nutrients, and because of high fishing, there was a possibility for jellyfish coming in as an invasive species. You come into a eutrophic state. In that eutrophic state, there was, after the 92-93, a quite heavy, strong reduction in nutrients again. So the conditions improved, but instead of going back here, it goes into here in another state where you have still jellyfish and you have big phytoplankton dinoflagellates. So the food web gets quite inefficient and does not support as much zooplankton and as much fish. So again, it's an illustrative case where three different drivers like invasive species, eutrophication, and even sometimes a bit climate affected the system, and leading to a case where even after reducing the nutrients, the system did not go back to this pristine stage with a lot of fish. Okay, but what about the Baltic? In principle, we are talking about the Baltic here, and so how is the case in the Baltic? Well, not that simple. We probably went through that. The characteristic of the Baltic, we have quite a strong gradient in terms of diversity. Has been quite eutrophic, or is still quite eutrophic. We have overfishing. We have influences through climate, so warmer winters and so on. So from the south to the north, we see the strong gradient in temperature and salinity and diversity. So both the diversity decrease, the temperature decrease, and salinity decrease up to the north. So in a way, a perfect case study to analyze what's the likelihood of such changes in the system. So in this aim, I've been working collecting the different monitoring data, which has been collected by a lot of different people and institutions. For example, Baltic Nest, Miguel is here, and HELCOM and ICES and so on, to compare how the system changed along this gradient over time. I don't go into any details here. I have used different methods. It's not so important right now here for you guys. Just to illustrate, we have been using quite a lot of monitoring from the different systems, and so biotic from phytoplankton, zooplankton, benthos to fish, to abiotic, temperature, nutrients, salinity, and so on. So having quite a lot of time series from these different areas of the Baltic Sea. When you do this statistical test, which doesn't give you at the same time right mechanistic right now, but it just gives you an indication, we see here from those different areas, probably it's a bit hard to see, that around the late 80s or so, there was, in most of the system, was actually quite a change going on in the composition and structure of the different basins of the Baltic. When we analyze then, because we are of course interested, okay, if that is at the same time, is there a common driver affecting that, the system? We found that the winter climate could explain something, but only 10 or 17% or so not much. We see that the biological structure in those different basins from the south to the north somewhere change or shift here in the 1990s. And most interestingly is then we check if those changes, to what drivers were they associated. And the interesting thing here is that, just look here on those stars, is that we're having the different systems here from the north to the south, and you see different drivers from temperature, salinity, phosphorus and fishing. You see that the different basins are affected differently by the drivers. So you don't have a common pattern. There was an overall pattern that maybe climate triggered the shift, but the long-term dynamics was often affected by the combination of different drivers in the different systems. So there might be a climate-induced change going on there, but at the same time we have basin-specific drivers affecting the basins. So if you want to do any ecosystem-based management, that needs to be basin-specific. Okay, this was because if you want to study ecosystems and regime shifts, you need to have the ecosystem perspective on it. So you're trying to use methods which reflecting or giving a proxy of your ecosystem change. But this doesn't give you at the same time an understanding of the processes, because you're summarizing your different variables together. So, but of course we're interested in what really happened. So now I go through some of the different components of the ecosystems. As you all know, eutrophication is affecting the primary production in anoxic areas. Here's a figure from Olaf Safschuk. This is the area covered, which is anoxic. There's some natural anoxic area, but today we have a 6 times increase. So it's a much larger area of anoxic, and that's due to eutrophication. In some areas we still have trends, positive or at least constant, of phosphorus and nitrogen. In some areas we have quite a reduction in nutrients, for example in the south. So we have a different combination. And it's quite interesting in terms of phytoplankton. It's very, if you summarize them together, here's one example from Bo Gustafsson and Bärbel Melekol from Baltic Nest Institute. They reconstructed the phytoplankton and nutrient load to the central Baltic here. And you see that this is the nutrient load here. In the 1940s, 50s, it started to increase quite heavily. So this is the nutrient load both together, nitrogen and phosphorus. Then the phytoplankton, after some time lag, is also increased quite heavily. So this is the eutrophication phase. So you see this overall signature in terms of the eutrophication. But if you go a bit more into detail in your phytoplankton composition, and as I understood you have been also counting now on this phytoplankton, Asker, well, it's not so simple. First of all, for phytoplankton, for example, for spring bloom, you need to have quite intensive phytoplankton sampling. And but often the sampling can be a monthly scale or so on. So you need to have a proxy, and one proxy, for example, for diatom sampling is silicate. So you see there's a quite change going on here in silica. A general trend is there is cold winters is often diatom in the spring bloom. After mild winters, more dinoflagellates or other mobile species. And it seems to be quite some grazing in those mild winter from zooplankton or ciliates on those diatoms. That's why they're not come up. Then at the same time, to really associate the phytoplankton composition to eutrophication is not that easy. There's been some new studies showing that can be quite difficult to do that. But in general, yes, there's an increase in phytoplankton. What about zooplankton? Well, we see quite some changes in the zooplankton dynamics. In general, there are some species which are heavily linked to climate. And in the Baltic, one of the main drivers is, of course, eutrophication in terms of phytoplankton growth, but also temperature and salinity. And here I show you some examples how they can change. These are two species which are pushed by temperature in the spring, so they are increasing over the late 90s, around the time when the regime shift, when we found the regime shift in the Baltic. And at the same time, due to decrease in salinity, this species here, Pseudocalanus zooplankton, quite important for cod recruitment, I come to that later, is decreasing. So we see changes in phytoplankton, we see changes in zooplankton. They are species specific. If we go step by step a bit higher up, what about the fish? Well, there's direct and indirect effects of climate, and it seems to be that because of high fishing, you're getting smaller species, an earlier maturation of those species, and those ones are more sensitive to climate, so you get a higher fluctuation. In the Baltic, well, we're having the example of, for example, spread. It's affected by the temperature, whereby cod is affected by the anoxic area and salinity. And then you're having some indirect effects of zooplankton and bentods. The fisheries is quite important here because it affects the structure and the dynamics of the fish and might affect the trophic cascade. In earlier times, yes, believe it or not, they have fished these kind of species, big cod in the Baltic. It was some years ago actually. But what happens if you look through these fish dynamics? Here we have the cod dynamics. So it has been low in the early 20th century, but then has been increasing here quite heavily. And that increase in cod is actually probably not so common. There was a period where the eutrophication started, a period where the seal decreased quite heavily. Seal is heavily eating cod. So seal at the same time decreased, and there was a low fishing mortality. So it's a combination of different factors leading to the fact that cod could increase quite heavily. Then during those conditions, the reproduction went down of the cod quite heavily due to anoxic area. I'll show you that in a minute. And at the same time, there was quite still high fishing going on. So the cod decreased quite drastically. And due to the reduction in the cod biomass, the spread could go up quite heavily also. So that's why people sometimes call that's the cod-dominated state and that's the spread-dominated state. Quite interestingly is actually what happens with the spread, because cod is eating spread quite heavily, and this is a summary for the Central Baltic Sea. But in the early 80s, because there was quite good conditions of salinity and there was still a lot of oxygen in the bottom, the spawning areas are here indicated by the black areas here. So they were pretty high up even to the northern Gotland area. But then because of the Antarctic area increasing, today the spawning area is only here in the Bornholm Basin. So the spawning area has decreased quite heavily. So the cod is over here right now. And interestingly, what the spread is doing, the spread is actually moving. Earlier times it has been all over here, but now it's moving more to the north, whereas of course no cod. So they're escaping from the predation pressure. So there are quite some spatial dynamics going on here. Back to regime shifts. We saw that one of the important indications for regime shift is a change in the relationship. Remember this curve with phosphorus and the plant cover showed two lines, so two different kind of function changes. Similar is here. So this is during the high cod phase, the zooplankton is driven very heavily by hydrodynamics, temperature and salinity. But during the low cod season, in the last 15 years or so, the zooplankton is very much driven by the predation of spread, because spread eats zooplankton. So you see that after a certain threshold of cod biomass, which is induced by climate and also fishing, the relationships change. This is a paper which tried to illustrate this kind of change. So in this cod-dominated state, you have quite a lot of cod, not so much spread. And here is one, this is zooplankton, because cod larvae eat a small zooplankton called Solicalanus. And that Solicalanus was very much driven by salinity. The conditions were very good. But then, due to the increase in fishing and temperature and so on, the cod biomass decreased, and due to that was the spread, the biomass increase, and the spread is affecting eating quite a lot of these Solicalanus, and which is a bad condition for the cod larvae. At the same time, they found in some areas that spread is eating cod eggs. So here you're having a feedback mechanisms where the spread may control the cod biomass via the grazing or the predation on zooplankton, which is important for the cod larvae, and at the same time eating cod eggs. Here I illustrate the potential feedback mechanisms. So we're having here the cod, and there's a predation pressure on in this case, the spread and herring, and they do eat the zooplankton. So the zooplankton might reduce the reproduction of that cod. But at the same time, we're having an increase in nutrients. So the phytoplankton is increasing, leading to an anoxic area. and having a feedback on phosphorus release from the sediment in the Baltic. So coming phosphorus again up to the open water. And at the same time that this anoxic area influencing the reproduction of cod. These are the structures or the dynamics mostly from the Central Baltic Sea. But the question is, of course, the basins are connected. Does it matter for other basins? Here is a study where we analyze. This is again the cod curve from the Central Baltic Sea. Remember that there was here the high cod in the 80s and then the low cod in the recent years. And most of the cod was here in the southern area, but then during this high peak period, I said they were all over because they were the spawning areas were from the south up almost to the Gotland area. And they're even going into the Gulf of Riga here. So what we looked is, does this, and then it disappeared again because the cod decreases. So there was no cod going into here. So we were interested in how does this spillover effect from the Central Baltic Sea in the Gulf of Riga changes the food web dynamics in the Gulf of Riga. And it's actually quite interesting. Here is the cod index in the Gulf of Riga. Here are all the data from the Gulf of Riga. What we see first of time is an increase in herring population, because cod was eating herring before. When cod goes down, herring increases. At the same time, the zooplankton decreased a bit, but was also favored by temperature. And phytoplanktons increasing. I show that maybe a bit better here in this area here. So the main basin, if you have cod, goes into the Gulf of Riga, affecting the herring population size. And because of fishery and temperature, this affects the zooplankton dynamics, grazing on the phytoplankton, but at the same time, a top-down effect. But at the same time, the quality of nutrients here indicated with river runoff going into the Gulf of Riga, one of the highest eutrophication areas actually in the Baltic. So there's still a lot of nutrients coming into the Gulf of Riga and affecting the phytoplankton besides temperature. So that illustrates that a regime shift or a change in the structure in one area may affect another area as well. But the question then, is that common for all basins? Here we're analyzing the data from Kattegat, southern Baltic Sea. It's an interesting case because it's relatively shallow, so 1/3 of that area is above the photic depth, so there's still possibility for quite high good possibility for benthic organisms and seagrass and so on. And it's been a case reported where they have reducing nutrients quite successfully. And not only nutrients, also fishing. So we've been analyzing the long-term data from the entire food web a bit, and what we see actually is that we're having a phase here in the 80s where it was a typical eutrophic phase. Quite high primary production, low secchi depth and so on. But then, due to climate change, because there was strong westerly winds coming in from the North Sea, bringing in some fresh water from the North Sea, not fresh water, but high saline water. And at the same time, reduction of nutrient load from land, leading to a shift from a pelagic dominant phase to a more benthic phase. They still have in some coastal areas still anoxic areas, but there are quite some large areas where there is no oxygen and where the flatfish is increasing also due to temperature. So there's been a change from the pelagic to the benthic state. So you see, they're very different, the basins. They are connected, but they can be also very different. So now I'm going to a study where we wanted to test is the shift if we see in the Central Baltic. Now I'm back to the Central Baltic. We see it was before was a more cod dominated phase, and now to a bit more spat dominated phase. But the question is it possible to reverse it? Nowadays they have decreased fishing quite heavily, so there are some symptoms of cod increasing again. So what's the potential that we could reverse the shift? Before I go into details, I just want to give you some there was a literature study from a lot of different systems, marine and terrestrial systems worldwide. Where they analyze often on species level how well do they recover after a certain pressure. And they found that well, there's some hope. So in some areas where there has been quite a good ecosystem management, reducing nutrients, for example, or reducing any other pressures, species do seem to come back. But it was very obvious that quite a lot of systems only partially recover. And now if you remember the case from the Black Sea and the coral reefs, is that the recovery was also there only partial, because we didn't come back to the earlier pristine state. We come back to go into a state where we have different function compared to earlier years. So this is called, in this case, partial recovery. I would like a bit more call it ecosystem regeneration. Anyway, so in this study we analyzed how, for example, threshold in these past food web dynamics in the Central Baltic may affect the system, and what's the potential for regeneration or recovery. I did it with some methods, don't worry about that. I'll just show you an example how that in principle works. So we had like over 30 years of data, and this is again the important species called Pseudocalanus, which was, remember, it was important for cod larvae eating that. And this is a statistical model trying to understand what the zooplankton dynamics depends on. In this case, it depends on, we had planktivore fish, in this case spat and herring, eating that zooplankton. So that's a negative relationship. But at the same time, this species likes a bit more saline water. So if the salinity is high, the biomass of that species is also increasing. But remember from this regime shift theory thing is that you need to have two different relationships if it's really a regime shift. So here we analyze with a statistical tool if the biomass of cod is important for that relationship here. And it's quite interesting, if the cod biomass is high, that zooplankton species pretty much is driven by salinity. But if it's low, then it's driven by the spat and herring. So we did that for the entire food web as an example. I don't go into any details here. What we do see is we see their thresholds, their dynamics, and I summarize that a bit here. So we see that fishing pressure is quite important to determine the cod biomass. Then cod is eating spat and herring, but mostly spat. Spat is affected by temperature, And herring is affected again by fishing, but also there's competition between those two because spread biomass is much higher than herring biomass, and they both compete for the same zooplankton. Then those two affecting the zooplankton, which I just showed you, and that affects the cod recruitment. So by that we're building a kind of a food web model, linking those different things together, and wanted to do some simulations to see what's the regeneration potential. So we're having, remember we have these shift. We want interested in would it be possible to increase it again or to have the same state as earlier. But it's important to realize also that at the same time today we have completely different climate conditions with a different temperature and salinity compared to 30 years or so. So this is the temperature curve here, so it's higher compared to earlier. And salinity, well, it's both. It's a quite high gradient of low, but then now it's increasing again. So what we are doing now is we did a simulation on that by changing the cod fishing, so from very little fishing to very high fishing, under past and today's climate. Okay, so we start here, very low fishing, very high cod. Then we increase fishing, the cod biomass goes down because we take out fish off the system. But that's under past climate condition. Then we change to the current climate, today's climate, and from high fishing we decrease fishing step by step. What we see is that we do not come back the same curve, because the different climate conditions seems to affect somehow the cod biomass. Same time, this is spread here. Spread is low because there's still high grazing of or high eating from cod on spread. But in the new climate, because spread is favored by higher temperature, the spread biomass is higher even if the cod is increasing. And this is the other species, the zooplankton species, Pseudocalanos. Same there, that today the Pseudocalanos is lower, affecting the cod recruitment. So what we see here, we see also a change in variability. But what we see here is that the cod biomass is under the current climate conditions, even though there is a recovery or an increase in cod, it's about 60% lower or so, and there's a higher spread biomass and a lower Pseudocalanos biomass. So that means that the current climate actually can affect the system, and there is not a recovery, it's more a regeneration or a transformation to another system. This has been called in some systems called a shifting baseline, so that even if you're reducing the nutrients again, you might not come back to that state. So based on this study, we see there seems to be threshold dynamics in the food web. The interplay between climate and fishing seems to be quite important, and there might be a shifting baseline. And so that in terms of ecosystem-based management, it's quite important to realize that it might not be realistic to set a target of a certain species, because that in the food web dynamics is affected by a lot of different interactions. So if we look on the Baltic Sea, it seems to be that we have undergone regime shifts in the last 30 years or so. In the Central Baltic Sea, we have a positive case, so to say, in the Kattegat, where the nutrient reduction caused a shift from the mere benthic production. But we see also that there seems to be a lot of interacting drivers. It's not just one single driver. It's a combination of those drivers. We see spatial effects. So we have seen that the changes in the Central Baltic Sea can affect the Gulf of Riga system. We do see also that there's no general case. We have a lot of species dynamics and interactions which are very local or basin depending. We see also that the effects of the drivers are basin dependent. So that's quite important. However, there's still quite a lot of unknowns. We don't know really how strong the feedbacks are. For example, the feedback of spread eating cod eggs. So therefore, if you have a high spread biomass, it's not possible for the cod to come up again because the spread is eating all the time the eggs. It's found in some areas, but we don't know if it's common for all areas. We don't know if that feedback, for example, is strong enough. It seems to be at the same time that the feedbacks, one of the main problems also is the feedback that is spatially different. That's important, and in particular also what's the coastal offshore, because herring, for example, is recruiting going often from the central into the coastal areas, and in those coastal areas, because cod is not coming in anymore, there might be other fish as perch or sticklebacks going up there eating a lot of zooplankton, so that the herring cannot find enough zooplankton. So the herring is getting smaller and smaller and thinner. And it's the same with the cod in the areas, southern areas of the basins, Bornholm Basin. The new cod they found a number increasing, but the weight of those cod is decreasing quite heavily. So they're getting thinner and thinner. And one reason is because the spread is moving northwards. So there's a lot of spatial interactions, and we don't know really what's going on there. A third important factor is that we have little understanding of the interaction of drivers, and that's very, very hard to test. You can test an experiment under controlled condition and changing one thing at a time and see how the system reacts. But in reality, you're having a system which is affected by a lot of different drivers at the same time. So it's often difficult to disentangle that only one particular driver is affecting that system. Often a combination, and it's as we saw, for example, in the study of with a change in the fishing pressure under different climate conditions, there's an interplay between those drivers, which is different after certain thresholds. So those kind of things we have very little knowledge, and we need to do more. So this was the Baltic, and now I'm moving a bit more in general terms. So why are regime shifts important? Well, they often have, in general, large impacts on human well-being, because in a lot of areas food production is changing due to partly regime shifts, and it's very hard to manage those. Because of those feedbacks, these hysteresis effects and so on, they might be sometimes very difficult and costly to reverse, or to at least increase a certain ecosystem service again. Because they are non-linear and can be triggered by a certain moment, so it can become very difficult to predict those. That's quite important for management to consider that. So they really need an approach where they try to not only look into one species, look more into the ecosystem dynamics, because those species recoveries are depending on interactions in species and drivers. The management also requires to cope with these shifts, so it should include a kind of adaptive management, so be prepared for a certain shift. And it might be good to know what are the factors triggering a certain shift. So just to give an update where the research is right now, well, they try to compare a lot of different regime shifts to get a better understanding if there are a general change going on. What are the general properties of a system affecting the likelihood of a regime shift? They're working on, especially interesting for management, on early warning indicators. Are there system properties that can be used to get a better understanding if a system might change? So in early warning indicators, there's often they see in some modeling and experiment cases that the variance, for example, or the kind of autocorrelation function is called, some indicators showing an increase before the wheel shifting, before the system is really shifting, so that management has time to affect those and so that the shift might prevent the shift by that. But in terms of real ecosystem monitoring data, it's probably quite difficult to do so. Some of these cross-scale dynamics, because the drivers are of course not local, they're often affected globally. For example, fishing. There's a tendency that fishing fleets can come into certain areas driven by the global market and the global price and so on. So there's a kind of large scale or cross scale dynamics. Then they try to link those between how much ecosystem services does each regime provide, so how much food, for example, or recreation. And especially also they're working on method to try to account for these ecosystem changes or dynamics, which is also a quite heavy area. So one way to, for example, comparing regime shift, we at the Stockholm Resilience Center hosting a regime shift database where a lot of different cases are in there and try to understand those. And so we're having a lot of aquatic systems here, climate system, terrestrial systems, and check what are the underlying drivers, what are the feedback mechanisms, can we understand it from a more general way. That's the idea with that database. And then this is a quite interesting statement from Bud Solling here that well, not only the science, I mean, I told about that, we have quite some unknowns still, but not only the science is incomplete, the ecosystem itself is a moving target, because those thresholds we found, for example, 10 years ago, or if we analyzing the past data, because of the compound or the interacting effects of those drivers, the threshold might be different in the next 10 years or so. Because the system in itself is adapting or changing. So it's a moving target, and that needs to be incorporated in these management approaches. That's all. Thanks a lot.